Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Ruby Golo, the Acting Executive Director for Global Chamber here in Accra, Ghana. For those new to Global Chamber, we are the only chamber that operates in many metros in about 196 countries dotted around the world. Our business is to help companies connect and do business globally without worrying to travel to those markets. And so if you like what we do here today and you like to know more, please feel free to reach out to me. I will later on put my contact details in the chat and you can reach me directly. So just a few housekeeping. Please keep your microphones on mute unless you are called to speak during the Q&A section. Otherwise, feel free to network using the chat room. And if you wish, you can post your contact details on there so that people can reach you directly. So we are in the election season, and for us in Ghana, we have 40 more days from today to our elections, which is December 7th. But the spotlight for today is on the US election, which is in a couple of days. And so we are so fortunate to have our own Dr. Sarita Jackson to tell us what we should expect after the US election and how that will impact US-Africa trade activities in general. Dr. Sarita is a founder, president, and CEO of the Global Research Institute of International Trade, LLC, in short, GRIIT, a Los Angeles-based think tank and consulting firm. Her firm saves exporters time and money, as well as reduce their risk with the proper tools and resources as they expand to and from the US market. She does so through customized market research and analysis development of a strategy that makes sense for a particular firm and connections with trusted advisors and partners. Dr. Jackson is an author. Additionally, she is a tech speaker and adjunct professor. She received her BA degree in broadcasting journalism and Spanish from the University of Southern California and earned a PhD in political science with emphasis on international political economy from Brown University. She's very fluent in English and Spanish. And I would say, hola, Dr. Sarita, great to have you speak to us on the topic today. The floor is yours.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Hola, Ruby. And welcome to everyone. Good day to everyone. I'm so glad to see you on the call today, and especially with regard to this topic with regards to the 2024 US presidential elections, and then what this means specifically for US-Africa trade. And so, as Ruby mentioned, I come from a political science background. Even though my focus is international trade and working with companies to import and export and be competitive and doing research so that they can compete globally and develop a strategy that will help them to compete over the long term and grow their businesses by integrating into the global economy. I always tell everyone I come from a slightly different angle. It's more of the policy angle. And I know when I started out with GRIIT, and I would talk to people about policy, what's happening. And when I say policy, I'm talking about what's happening with trade agreements, trade programs. Speaking of trade programs, the African Growth and Opportunities Act, or AGOA, which I will talk about in more detail as I go through the presentation. And it just kind of, business owners would kind of look at me like, why should I care? What does this, that's just something that they're dealing with in Washington, D.C., or the heads of states of different countries. That's just something that they do, but that has nothing to do with my day-to-day operation. And nothing is further from the truth. And we see that, especially within the last few years, the last different election cycles here in the United States, when policies would change dramatically, then companies understood that there is not a disconnect between your business and policy. It's the policies that have an impact on your business and your ability to operate, to access other markets, to purchase from other markets. It's those policies that shape what businesses are able to do in the global economy. And so that's what I look at when I talk about trade between the United States and countries throughout Africa. And that sets the precedent for what we're going to look at today. And I just want to let you know, this is really a conversation. I'm going to go through it, but I look forward to hearing from many of you on the call, your different perspectives, and as well as asking any questions. So think of this as a conversation. So for today, we're going to look at just kind of what is the landscape currently here in the United States with regard to our policy or different efforts, programs, initiatives toward the continent of Africa. And when I talk about Africa, mainly sub-Saharan Africa, not necessarily the Northern African countries, because many of the policies and initiatives are geared toward the sub-Saharan African region. Then look at what is on the table for now, based on what is on record of the top two US presidential candidates. Yes, there are others in the race, but we're just sticking with the two key US presidential candidates, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, and our current vice president, Kamala Harris, just to kind of get a sense of where they stand, to give us a sense of what we can expect moving forward, and then what to watch out for with the elections. Literally, we have one more week. So next Tuesday, that's election day. So what can we expect in terms of US-Africa trade, but bringing that down not just at the United States and the region as a whole, but what should businesses look at outside of just the short-term business transactions, but what are some of the other issues that are being discussed as they relate to international trade and that may have an impact on doing business with the United States and different African countries. Then I'll talk about a couple of case studies, just some of the work that I've done with a couple of clients, one trying to export and another import under the current climate. And then at the end, I would appreciate your feedback. We'll open it up for Q&A, but there is a poll that will be added to the chat toward the end, and I would really appreciate your feedback as I continue to develop this talk and other works related to this topic. All right, so when we look at the current US-Africa trade efforts or the policy, there's been quite a bit of activity just within the last 2 years. Before I mention these activities, the one thing that I definitely want to talk about, to take note of, you don't see it on the slide, but please take note of this because I will reference it. The African Growth and Opportunities Act, and if Jem, if you could just type that in, or Ruby, either one of you, just so that people can see it. The African Growth and Opportunities Act precedes everything that you see on this timeline here, or AGOA. That's what we often refer to, AGOA. And what that is that is a trade program. I always distinguish between AGOA and trade agreements that we hear about that are negotiated between two or more countries to offer reciprocal benefits. This is a trade program that was established or took effect in 2000. So now it's 24 years old, 2000. And the whole goal of this was to facilitate trade between the United States and eligible sub-Saharan African countries for eligible products. And the benefit is it gives producers in the eligible sub-Saharan African countries access to the US market. And what that really means, so that they can compete, is being able to sell their goods to the United States, to consumers in the United States or buyers in the United States, and not have duties placed on those goods. And then the benefit for importers here in the United States is, well, I can buy goods from a supplier in an eligible sub-Saharan African country and do not have to have duties on it. So that's something very important to note. And that has really driven a lot of our economic integration, if you will, is AGOA. Now, fast forward to 2022, what we've seen with regard to the US policy under the current administration, so this just focuses on the current administration, is that in August of 2022, the Biden administration under the current president, Joe Biden, they established this US strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa. And this is really just to really boost our commitment or to invest more to show the US commitment to investing in the region, doing trade within the region, and then other areas, really promoting democratic governance, building infrastructure, looking at other areas, agriculture, health, security. So really develop, that's what this whole thing is, to focus on developing a strategy, a more strategic approach, looking at many different areas and to engage with the continent in these different areas. And one such area is the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment. And this was a promise with regard to the current administration, saying that along with the G7 countries, the group of 7 countries, which are mainly your developed economies, 7 developed economies, where they would invest $600 billion in infrastructure throughout the region. And so that is one of the things that came out, that came out of this current administration. A few months later, in 2022, you had the big US Africa Leaders Summit. And I remember, it seems like it was just yesterday, but I remember when that took place, just really following what came out of that. What are the discussions when it comes to this particular summit? And the key thing that I want to highlight with regard to the US Africa Leaders Summit is this digital transformation strategy. A few months ago, I gave a talk about business opportunities in Africa. And this was one of the things that I highlighted, because a lot of times when we talk about, or at least from what I've seen, different conversations may have a different focus. But what I've seen when I talk about AGOA or just trade with US Africa, it still comes down to agriculture. And I get it. I get agriculture, but really moving into the 21st century, what does it mean when we talk about digital trade? And I highlighted that. And even that's my book that came out in 2021, even though it focuses on services, still talks about digital trade for both goods and services. So this is one of the things that came out of that summit, to build the capacity to engage in digital trade. So that's this digital transformation strategy, and where there was a promise by the end of this summit of investing $350 million into building the digital transformation strategy, or implementing that strategy, so that you have digital access to technology, and being able to engage more when it comes to digital trade. So I just stress that, because that is something with the 21st century. It's no longer just about tariffs and movement of goods and agricultural products, but bringing it to what is happening around the world, and digital trade is where it is. And so this is one of the efforts to really build the capacity on the continent to engage in digital trade. Out of the summit also, now the person's position came to a conclusion in December of 2023. Nonetheless, out of that summit, where there was a special presidential representative for the US Africa Leaders Summit that was put in place to really help implement many of these initiatives that came out of the summit of December 2022. And then lastly, the key thing that we saw was where President Biden supported the African Union joining the G20 countries. So this is a group of 20 countries from developed and developing economies or emerging economies. Now with African Union, it's not quite 20, but at the time, it's the G20. They still refer to as the G20, but now you have the African Union that joined. The European Union is also a part of it, and then the individual countries. So this was something that we saw very significant by September of 2023, last year, where the African Union now is officially a part of G20. Okay, so now just to do a quick comparison. And again, as we all know, when it comes to political cycles, and this is not just in the United States, as Ruby and I were talking about, December 7th, you have the elections, the presidential elections in Ghana, and there are other countries throughout Africa where they had their elections earlier this year, a number in November. So the end of 2024 is going to be quite busy for a number of countries when it comes to the elections. But as I said, this is what we're seeing now. Now, what happens once the elections are over can change, but it's at least to set the idea of what is being discussed now or what is being put on the table. So when we come to looking at the former US President Donald Trump, who is running again, it's interesting because at least Prosper Africa came out of that administration. That was one of the strategic initiatives with Prosper Africa. There are other initiatives. You had Power Africa and Feed Africa was the one dealing with agriculture. And then now you have Prosper Africa, and there have been a number of activities surrounding Prosper Africa and to really promote AGOA from that perspective. Now, I do know, and I will throw in there, I do know you have the African Continental Free Trade Area. That is also something to look at, where the AFCFTA, African Continental Free Trade Area, where the whole goal of that is just on the continent itself to have the member countries to ratify the AFCFTA and really facilitate, promote trade within the region, intra-regional trade, to really build that capacity and implement different strategies so that it makes it easier for cross-border trade. So I'm aware of that. But what we have, since we're talking about the US and Africa, that you had this Prosper Africa initiative where you had a number of the agencies, government agencies that participate in this, and really develop programs to work with producers throughout Africa to leverage AGOA. So that's one good thing. Now, there have been different, recently I've been having different conversations, well, really throughout this whole year, quite frankly, with individuals that have been involved, and there are mixed responses as to the effectiveness of Prosper Africa, and that could be something that we can just open up during the discussion. But nonetheless, that just to lay the groundwork of what came out of that administration. The other thing that we see, bilateral trade versus multilateral preference programs. And as I mentioned with AGOA, that's unilateral, meaning, and when I say unilateral, for two reasons. One, it comes out of the United States, so it's not negotiated. It's not as if we go to the table to the different African countries, South Africa, Ghana, Kenya, and negotiate something so that it could be reciprocal or mutually beneficial. It comes out of the United States, number one. It is set to expire in September of next year, 2025. That's why I'm really also watching these elections, among a whole host of other reasons, but that's one of the things I'm watching to see what is going to happen with AGOA. And I'm still in contact with some of my contacts in Washington, D.C. on the lobbying efforts, so on and so forth. But we're trying to see if this will be reauthorized. But what we had during the Trump's first term, was this focus on bilateral trade. And I find this interesting. The reason being is just a couple of weeks ago, I had lunch with a dear friend, and they asked me, how do I feel about our policy towards the region, towards the African region. And I said, well, one of the things that we need to do, this is just my personal opinion, is to really also focus on how these programs fit within the context of the 21st century. AGOA goes back to 2000, right at the beginning of the 21st century, but so many other things have happened since 2000 that may impact the effectiveness of a unilateral program such as AGOA. And I was saying that, well, maybe we should look at doing some more bilateral trade. Our only country, actually, I'm going to throw this out there. I'm not going to say anything because I want to get some engagement with this one question. And if you want to turn on your camera so that I could see you, can anyone tell me how many countries does the United States have a free trade agreement with? And which countries? Oh, David?
Yeah, Dr. Jackson, I know it's a lot. I don't know if it's all the way to 100, but it's quite a bit. And I know I can list off a dozen or so if you want me to.
Wait, with the African countries? African countries alone?
Oh, no, just
African
African countries. I'm very familiar with the AGOA.
Okay. Well, that's a good start. That's good.
That doesn't help much. Yeah, I would have to abstain because AGOA is the one that I'm really familiar with.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Okay. Anybody else want to give it a shot or before I reveal? All right. Okay. So thank you, David, for that on AGOA, mentioning AGOA. But remember what I said at the beginning, that's not a trade agreement, a bilateral trade agreement. We only have, can you believe, out of all of the countries on the continent, one bilateral trade agreement. And it's not in sub-Saharan Africa. It's with Morocco.
Wow.
A good friend of mine is getting ready to travel Thursday on Morocco. That's the only trade agreement that we have. Interesting. So with going back to the former President Trump, he started to focus on this more bilateral approach. And the benefit, and people may have different opinions about it, but just generally speaking, the starting point in terms of the benefit is that now countries can negotiate the terms. It's not the terms are placed on you. This is what the agreement is, and this is what you have to do in order to get access to our US market. It's now reciprocal in the sense of now exporters from the US can export to a market, whatever country in Africa. Well, for Morocco, let's just use Morocco as an example. We can export to Morocco duty-free, and the exporters in Morocco can do the same for the United States. AGOA, going back to that unilateral part, it's only the exporters from the eligible AGOA countries that can export to the United States duty-free. But if I want to export, I don't have that benefit. I benefit here in the United States as an importer, but not as an exporter. So that's why it's unilateral, just one way when it comes to benefits for the exporter. But we only have one free trade agreement, meaning that it is negotiated so that both sides can determine the terms of that agreement. Under Trump, there was an effort with Kenya. They started the negotiations and then it just never concluded. So what we have now is what's called STIP, the Strategic Trade Investment Partnership, STIP, that took effect in 2022. So it's not quite a comprehensive trade agreement, but at least it's some kind of initiative to promote trade between the United States and Kenya. But under the Trump's first administration, that was what he started to push more towards these bilateral trade agreements as opposed to the multilateral trade agreement, or really pushing AGOA, even though I did mention Prosper Africa. But then again, there have been, when I've talked to people that have participated, it varies in terms of the viewpoints about the effectiveness, and I'll just leave it at that. And then AGOA, I have AGOA and America First, just really to say, and you're going to see this from both sides, that really here in the United States, there's been more of a push. I don't want to quite use the term protectionism, but really focusing on US producers in the conversations or in the speeches. You will hear more of that about protecting US manufacturers, the US workers, and things like that. So there, let's just say, just a tad bit more tension when we talk about some of these trade policies, to really examine them and make sure that, just from the language, make sure that we are putting America first. And so we see that in some of the policies, really on both sides. I'm just looking at both sides. It's not just with Trump. So speaking of that, I will use that as a segue to go into what we're seeing with our vice president and some of the things that she has proposed and what we can look at. When it comes to digital trade, she has really pushed for digital trade and has announced an initiative to invest to really enhance digital trade or access to digital trade within a certain amount of time. So that's one of the things that we are seeing with our Vice President, Kamala Harris, our presidential candidate. And then again, that builds off of what we already saw that I pointed out with regard to what came out, the different types of initiatives 2 years ago to really promote digital trade. Another area that she has really been focused on has been climate change. And when you look at Kamala Harris's positions just on trade in general, not just with regard to trade with the African region, that has been one of the issues in trade agreements, trade programs. What do they say when it comes to environmental standards? Are there rules or language within these different policies to make sure that, yes, we're promoting trade, but not at the expense of the environment? Or especially with climate change continuing to be a top issue, that's one of the things that we're seeing in terms of what she's talking about and looking at the relationship with trade. What does this mean for the environment and what impact does this have on climate change? The other thing that I want to highlight, geopolitics. And I will say, when I talk about geopolitics, that's really with regard to here in the United States, a lot with regard to China when it comes to international trade. The policies on both sides really, generally speaking, are making sure that China plays fair when it comes to international trade, follows the rules that are set by the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. That's the larger international institution where countries that are part of the WTO, China is a part of the WTO, that when they join the WTO, that they follow these rules. And the whole focus is to keep trade liberalized, to liberalize trade. And what does that mean? That means that we keep tariffs low, not no tariffs, because if everybody opened up their markets, that will be quite challenging. But to just keep tariffs low so that you can have producers, overseas producers, access that market, provide many needed goods and services, things of that nature. Also, regulatory standards. That's another area that trade is not just about tariffs, but also what kind of regulations are put in place that may protect the environment, that protect consumers while not hindering trade, that set these kinds of standards without serving as a barrier to trade. So when it comes to geopolitics on both sides, it's, well, how do we make sure that China plays fair, protect our workers, but also when it comes to Africa, on with regard to Kamala Harris, is how do we make sure that the United States continues to invest and play a key role, because China has a huge presence throughout the continent. And so what we're seeing is policies or discussions, nothing quite specific, discussions about how do we make sure that we invest. But what I will say is, with the previous administration, there were an increase in tariffs on a number of products coming from China. Well, let's say with the current administration, those tariffs were not removed, even though we hear criticisms of it or have increasing tariffs on goods coming from China, the policy has remained the same and then some. And when I say and then some, meaning that, for example, electric vehicles, other products where we see new tariffs were added and really high tariffs, if you will, within the last couple of years. So I just wanted to point that out. And then her focus with youth empowerment, working with female business owners, making sure that as a part of these trade policies, or just broadly speaking, economic integration policies, that there's also a focus on the youth and women. So what can we expect? Just a general thing to look out for that I'll bring this to for business owners. So when we'll see what happens next Tuesday or whenever the ballot counts, once the counts are final, the thing that I will be looking for and recommend that we all look for is what's going to happen with the outcome. What impact will that have on AGOA reauthorization? Because unlike a trade agreement where once they're set in stone, once they're set and implemented, they pretty much are set. But there are clauses, I won't get too technical, but there are clauses if one country does decide to withdraw or something like that. But they pretty much are set. There isn't an expiration date. But with a program such as AGOA, it is set for a certain amount of time. So the most recent reauthorization was reauthorized until 2025. So we'll see with the outcome of the presidential elections and what's happening in Congress, because it is Congress that does the reauthorization, to see what happens by September of 2025 to keep that commitment, at least under AGOA, until we see more development when it comes to the African Continental Free Trade Area or the possibility of bilateral trade deals. Right now, the main thing driving U.S.-Africa trade is AGOA. So to watch out and see what happens with the outcome and what that may mean for the reauthorization of AGOA. Also, with regard to infrastructure, and these were the things that I mentioned earlier, looking at trade, but how that has an impact, the policies when it comes to developing the infrastructure, health matters, climate, security, the geopolitical strategy. And I did put in that word I said earlier, I did not want to use, but it is being discussed. Now, we can always discuss, is this really protectionist or not? But nonetheless, just the general conversation. Is the United States becoming more protectionist? And in some areas, yes. When it comes to energy, we are seeing that where, when you talk about free trade, you're not supposed to subsidize certain industries or things like that, but you're seeing that with tariffs on certain products or subsidizing certain industries, things of that nature. So that's some of the things to watch out in terms of the trends where we're going versus this idea of free trade, continuing to engage our trade partners and have these mutually beneficial or reciprocal trade agreements. So those are just some areas to watch out for. And then lastly, as I'm watching the time here, just lastly, just to kind of bring this down to, all right, okay, so I'm a business owner. That's all great. What does it mean for me? Well, when it comes to the trade policies, I go back to my opening statement that policies are not devoid of practice. The two go hand in hand. And when I've worked with clients, and these are mainly small business owners, once they understood that, and worked with me on how do you leverage AGOA, for example, those were the clients that did well. And when I say did well, where they actually were able to export, did not have things stuck in customs, and were able to experience growth of their business, revenue growth. And just briefly, for example, now I'm working with this one client, and we'll see, we just literally started working together last week. But one of the things that I was talking to him about, even though he's doing business in West Africa and doing business and trying to still figure out how do I expand throughout the region. So he's in one West African country. He's trying to figure out how to expand throughout the region. And when I mentioned AGOA, instead of working directly with the business, getting on some of these government contracts, he was not aware of it. And so this is an opportunity to work with him on understanding AGOA, understanding what the rules are, and especially with regard to, because this is something that comes up a lot with clients, whether it's AGOA or any other trade program or a trade agreement, where they think, oh, I'm going to do business in this country. Great. There's some preferential access there. However, I can import from another country a product that's less costly to produce, and then try to bring it through that country to take advantage of that market. And that's where I say, no, that's not how that works. So this is understanding the rules within these agreements, how you can leverage them, but leverage them without doing something that you're not supposed to do, and it will have a lot of costly implications later on. And the point is to grow your business, increase revenue, not pay money and fines and a lot of other stuff because you didn't do it right the first time. Then working with him on the government contracts. And the reason why I mentioned the government contracts, because there's money that goes to different government agencies, U.S. Agency for International Development being one. And I always throw that out because that's the one I worked on mostly, but some of these other agencies where they have contracts for infrastructure, if you are a company where you're involved in developing infrastructure, construction, architecture, those types of things, those are opportunities for you. Or in this case, this person with IT, information technology services, where you can get on contracts. Since we've talked about digital trade and different types of things, you can participate and get on some of these contracts and provide your service or sell a product and engage in trade. And then also with this client, connecting him with a network on the ground. Then just a second point, the detailed customized market research and strategy. That was a client I worked with earlier this year. We started earlier this year working together. And the same thing, where I did a detailed, this is the type of research, understanding for, in his case, bringing a product from Central Africa to the United States. But even though that person is here in the United States, still understand the environment here in the United States for that particular product, that cosmetics product, and what he needs to know when it comes to any kind of regulations, compliance matters. That was more of the focus versus trade statistics per se, but understanding the import process and leveraging AGOA. And as a result, within a couple of months, he was able to really see a significant amount of sales of that product here in the United States. I was really happy because he had traveled to Central Africa, came back, and I was really happy that he was able to make some sales by following all of the information that I provided to him before he traveled to Central Africa and then came back. And then just lastly, similar to what I'm doing here, like I said, exporting, you need persistence, determination, and grit. So I'm always happy, and grit with 2 I's. I'm always happy to speak with anyone, give interactive, in-depth training, workshops. What you're seeing here is just giving you some of the information, the knowledge, but to really dive deep and work with companies and organizations on how to leverage, develop an export plan, and compete globally, and then also giving keynote speeches. So for anyone on the call, I'm always happy to have a follow-up discussion on speaking with your organization. And that is it. And thank you. And I will open it up, but also if Jim, you could put in the poll, it's just 2 quick questions. And if there's anything you would like to share, testimonial, feel free just to take the poll. I always appreciate feedback. Thank you.
Okay. I just added the poll.
So the poll is in the chat box. Please do us the honors to complete it. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarita, for your great presentation and sharing your insights. We really appreciate your time today. The floor is open. Audience, if you have any questions for Dr. Sarita, please raise your hand and you'll be called to speak. Otherwise, you can put your question in the chat box and we'll get that across to her as well. Anyone wants to take the first question?
Actually, I will, and I apologize. I can't find the hand to stick up. So I'm not the best at the technology. So if it's all right. So thank you very much, Dr. Jackson. I really appreciate it. We're a company that's definitely looking to invest in becoming more involved in Africa over the next 5 years, and building relationships. And, one of the things that I've seen, watching the geopolitical impacts here in the United States and abroad is, looking at the two presidential candidates, their international trade policies are actually very similar in some cases. Both candidates are more than likely going to raise tariffs. Both candidates, more than likely, along with Congress, is going to expand forced labor enforcement. That's going to go beyond China. And this creates a lot of opportunities and advantages for businesses in Africa to capitalize on those obstacles, because those obstacles don't necessarily exist in Africa. And with hopefully AGOA being renewed and other things happening, like you mentioned in Morocco, do you see the same opportunities because of some of these geopolitical similarities with the two candidates, as well as what's happening globally?
Yeah, I do. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the labor part, because I agree with you. When you really look at both policies and dig deeper, at least based on what's out there now, there are a lot more similarities than there are differences. As I mentioned, this whole thing about making sure we protect our workers. And I mentioned that I like that you mentioned labor, because that is one of the things that drives the policies about protecting American workers. And the shift, a lot of what you're just seeing here in the United States, with a lot of strikes across a number of industries for fair wages to protect labor, when it comes to technology, these types of things. You're absolutely right. And there's one of the things I know that Kamala Harris had mentioned about outsourcing or selling our products, not our jobs, overseas. And I do think that it presents an opportunity when we look at the geopolitical, what is happening, like you said, beyond China. There's so many other things that I did not even mention that's happening in the world that is having an impact, but it does present an opportunity for US companies and companies throughout the continent of Africa to still engage, develop as I say, a policy that's going to address some of these issues, especially when it comes to labor, so that it is mutually beneficial, that it is truly reciprocal for all parties involved. I hope that answered your question.
It does, and I appreciate it. Maybe the one last follow-up question is, what ideas can you offer, or people or companies that U.S. business can connect with in Africa, whether it's Ghana or Zambia or others, to help become more engaged and help build awareness of how businesses in the U.S., manage themselves for importing and exporting? I think that's where there's sometimes a disconnect, is just a lack of awareness and education from the U.S. side with doing business in Africa.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing to start is really something like this, to have a cause like this, something that where it's a lower cost of entry, if you will, as we say, barriers to entry are low. And what I mean by that is this is a good start to really have the conversations. And I'm basing this on my experience when I started my company 11 years ago, and I was talking about Africa, and literally the response was, we need to focus on places where people are interested. I pushed and pushed and pushed and found that there are people that are interested. And when I was able to, from my company, collaborating with other organizations, setting up forums just like this, whether it was virtual or in person, to bring business owners, representatives, government officials as well, that have access to resources in the African countries, and connect with those here in the United States. That's a starting point, just to get the conversation going and having events like this. Then the second one, and I would love to hear others to chime in on this, but the second one also is just being aware of the resources. And what I mean by that, going back to the client the first client I mentioned, as opposed to I'm just kind of traveling around and trying to figure it out as I go along. Well, I know for me, I can't afford that. Like that's a lot to travel, get on a plane, you room and board, etc. And when I pointed out, well, here are a number of resources, avenues where there are projects based in Africa that's related to what you do, then this is also a way to speed up the process, if you will, to make those connections and do business on the continent. So my second part of that is being aware of the resources. And a lot of that I talk about in other workshops where, it's the more in-depth things on what are those resources and how do you find the resources, leverage the resources so that you can do business in those markets versus just kind of trying to figure it out on your own. And again, it takes a lot of time, energy, and money. And as business owners, being a business owner myself, you have to, try to function as efficiently as possible. So those are my two tips. And I would love to hear if anyone else has anything else to chime in on that based on their experience as well.
Thank you. The floor is still open. Do we have more questions? Otherwise, I'll start calling out people. Catherine, I see you are in the audience. I know you do a lot with the Asian countries, but what has been your experience with the US?
Do I have my microphone turned on?
Yes.
Okay. Honestly speaking, I don't have a huge amount of experience with the US because most of my experience is with Europe and then with Asia. So it's been a while since I've actually actively worked with the US. It's been a couple of decades, honestly speaking. So I'm more here to learn about how the US is likely to have impact on the rest of us. So yeah, thank you for that. It's been very interesting to listen to.
Thank you. Thank you for your feedback. Rachel, what do you think? Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the trade environment that we're in is, it's a fun time. My background is I used to work for Tony Robbins at Business Mastery. And so at Business Mastery, we do full scale growth, right? Well, in the past decade or so, growth has meant, digital. You've seen business owners transition to just starting to place their business online. What does that mean? Social media, that means websites, that means transitioning from traditional media into all of these streaming platforms. But now the technology is changing as such that you can be able to commerce through your website, through apps, through app development, right? So being kind of the chair for the Global Chamber, helping to bring some of those approaches to the business owner is, my goal, cost effective, maximum efficiency. But I will caution it with this: the implications for the election are serious right now. And we have to do things that are, I feel like if we could tie politics to one word, economics, I think everybody would understand how vital these elections are, because it really, really does impact every single day, every single one of our wallets. And more people need to see that, the political climate is also your personal bank account's climate. So that's all I had to say on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I agree. It comes down to economics, how you're impacted. And then, even as a business owner, just how you're impacted, because that impacts your personal economy, right? Your ability to operate and sustain yourself. So that's absolutely correct. And just one thing, Rachel, if I may ask, because I know when we just briefly talked, you had mentioned migration, and I would be interested in, kind of what you're seeing with that issue, especially where you're located. That's a huge issue that is a top issue
Sure.
with the US presidential election?
Sure. So, I mean, here's the reality of what's going on, and I'll try to make it brief. Currently, the current congressman who's been in this position for 20 years, he's up on 14 indictments. He's taken bribes from foreign entities that aren't benefiting the US. They're benefiting his pocketbook, and really it's going to keep the climate of trade here not favorable for us. You know, you see what's happening with the gangs, with the Venezuelans, with how, you know, the reality is most people don't see it here on the border, because what they're doing is, while it's reported there's 10 million migrants, it's really it's the unreported ones, the ones who are coming through in the middle of the night, right? Those ones who aren't, you know, aren't going through and getting themselves accounted for. So if it was the traditional American dream story of people moving, you know, across, you know, from third world countries, we would celebrate that. Unfortunately, these aren't. These are stories of rape, you know, criminal activity, murders. You know, this is not the dream of hope that they came here for. And so our American dream story has been poisoned because of what, you know, because we're using people to create an agenda, right? And when you actually look at how much dollar is given to what the cost of one of these to a migrant is, it's, you know, in the $7,000 to $9,000 a month range. You know, they get thousands of dollars to come here. And then if you actually look at what the government gives to migrants, just in total from grants, you really see economically. I've worked with business owners my whole life, like I said, for Tony Robbins. So I've interviewed over 10,000 of them. And it's very cost prohibitive for us as business owners to be able to make ends meet. But when you have a market that's watered down by people who have to work, right? Because they either owe the cartel money, or they just need to go make, you know, enough money to eat, that is always going to be a burden to, you know, whatever it is your industry is. And it all has a trickle down effect. You know, your neighbor next door to you, if their economy is difficult, it's just a zero sum game, I like to call it. So, you know, we're hopeful in this election. My client, I'm running, like I said, I'm running the campaign for Commander Furman. He's a 28-year Navy veteran. All he did was fly Blackhawks on the world's worst border, securing US interests and our allies' interests on those borders. So we're seeing good signs at the polls, but we also are seeing, you know, areas of cheating happening right now. And so hopefully the numbers, people, you can definitely tell, you can definitely see, you know, most of these polls are experiencing, I'd say in some cases, double the amount of voters. So something has changed in this election. Something has changed. And I think it's people realizing that, you know, we're using humans to weaponize an agenda. And so if, again, I'll close with this, if this was people coming here for opportunity, of hope, and of, you know, their scholastic ability to make America great, you know, we would 100% embrace and hug that. But sadly, that is not what's happening. And we have 600,000 illegal criminals as updated by ICE. And the reality is we have 300,000, maybe even 400,000 missing kids. So it's a lot more organized and a lot more hellacious of a story than what meets the media's eye.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you so much for that insight based on where your location and your involvement. And I just want to, because I see time is running out. There is a question from Nee. Let's see. So thanks for the presentation. Without intending to do a comparison, do the candidates see Africa in a strategic economic sense as the Chinese government perhaps? And let's see. I generally speaking, I would say that they do see the opportunities, the economic opportunities, because with the continent, I mean, you have a youthful population, the opportunities, especially with the AFCFTA, for economic growth, for the economies to grow. I do think they do see it in the economic sense. However, this is just my personal take on it, that it still comes more from that geopolitical. How do we make sure that we also maintain a presence by investing and then seeing the economies grow, but investing so that we can maintain a presence, because again, this is the whole, China has a huge presence and an influence. And so then the United States now is doing more. And it has done quite a bit when it comes to, one of the areas where I worked in with their trade hubs to promote economic integration. And then also when it comes to governance and things like that. But I do think that, yes, there is that part of it strategically, economically, but we can't leave out the geopolitical side of things as well.
Okay, on that note, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. The section was really interesting, and special thanks to Dr. Sarita for your time with us. We really appreciate your insight, and for those interested in knowing more, please feel free to connect with her on LinkedIn, or reach out to her directly. Or if you want an introduction, I'll be happy to do that as well. So thank you, everybody. I wish you all the best as you go about your business the rest of the week. Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.